Good evening, everybody. This is Jake Wynn, Director of Interpretation from the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. Hope everybody is having a happy Halloween. We are bringing you a special program this evening where we are going to tell a part ghost story, part Civil War medicine horror drama, a fictionalized account from the Atlantic magazine published in July of 1866, written by a Civil War surgeon. The Civil War surgeon that wrote this story, The Case of George Dedlow, was a surgeon from Philadelphia named Silas Weir Mitchell. Silas Weir Mitchell is a very famous Civil War surgeon known as the father of modern neurology, and he focused on the study of nerve injuries during the Civil War, but was also a Civil War surgeon and did all of the sorts of things that we've been talking about in many of our videos since the pandemic began in March. Silas Weir Mitchell writes this account in 1866. He fancied himself a writer in addition to being one of the most renowned surgeons in America at the time of the Civil War. And what is remarkable about this particular story and why I love this account so much is that many readers of the Atlantic magazine in the years after the Civil War did not know this was a fictional account. There was no anything dedicated to telling that this was a fictionalized account. And so people took this to heart. They believed that this was a real story. And why that matters is that many of the myths that we talk about at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, many of them appear in this story in different forms and fashions. So you'll hear those in this reading of The Case of George Dedlow. What else makes this story stand out and why I wanted to read it on Halloween is that we see some of the more obscure, more out on the limits of what Civil War medicine was. We're going to see things like neurology come into play here. We're going to talk about, in the case of George Dedlow, amputations. We're going to talk about anesthesia or the lack thereof. Again, those fictionalized accounts. We're also going to see something known as phantom limb, the idea that amputees could still have the feeling from their the missing limbs that they had lopped off during the Civil War. And this is a very real phenomenon that is still present today amongst those who lose limbs as a result of accidents, disasters, or warfare, even today. But what is important about this particular aspect in regards to Silas Weir Mitchell is Dr. Mitchell is one of the first to acknowledge that this was a very real phenomenon, that phantom limb syndrome was an actual thing. And so that's a real aspect of the case of George Dedlow that stands out, and that we see Silas Weir Mitchell kind of taking his experiences in the Civil War hospitals of Philadelphia and adapting them into a literary form. Where he takes that is a little extreme. So what you're going to see in this story that I'm going to read here in just a bit is you're going to see a seance, so perfect for Halloween. And we're going to meet some spirits, and they're going to be quite unusual, these particular spirits, and they're going to be very relevant to a museum professional like myself. We'll talk about that at the end of this story. So what we're going to do now, over the next couple of minutes, I'm going to do a reading of one of my favorite stories from the Civil War era, and that is The Case of George Dedlow, written by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell. Perfect for Halloween. I hope you all will enjoy this reading. The following notes of my own case have been declined on various pretexts by every medical journal to which I have offered them. There was perhaps some reason in this, because many of the medical facts which they record are not altogether new, and because the psychical deductions to which they have led me are not in themselves of medical interest. I ought to add that a good deal of what is here related is not of any scientific value whatsoever, but as one or two people on whose judgment I rely have advised me to print my narrative with all the personal details rather than in the dry shape to which, as a psychological statement, I shall publish it elsewhere. I have yielded to their views. I suspect, however, that the very character of my record will, in the eyes of some of my readers, tend to lessen the value of the metaphysical discoveries which it sets forth. I am the son of a physician, still in large practice, in the village of Abington, Schofield County, Indiana, expecting to act as His future partner, I studied medicine in his office, and in 1859 and 1860 attended lectures at the Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia. My second course should have been in the following year, but the outbreak of the rebellion so crippled my father's means that I was forced to abandon my intention. The demand for army surgeons at this time became very great. And although not a graduate, I found no difficulty in getting the place of assistant surgeon to the 10th Indiana Volunteers. In the subsequent Western campaigns, this organization suffered so severely that before the term of its service was over, it was merged into the 21st Indiana Volunteers. And I, as an extra surgeon, ranked by the medical officers of the latter regiment, was transferred to the 15th Indiana Cavalry. Like many physicians, I had contracted a strong taste for Army life, and disliking cavalry service, sought and obtained the position of first lieutenant in the 79th Indiana Volunteers, an infantry regiment of excellent character. On the day after I assumed the command of my company, which had no captain, we were sent to garrison a part of the line of blockhouses stretching along the Cumberland River below Nashville, then occupied by a portion of the command of General Rosecrans. The life we had led on duty was tedious and at the same time dangerous in the extreme. Food was scarce and bad, the water horrible, and we had no cavalry to forage for us. If, as infantry, we attempted to levy supplies upon the scattered farms around us, the population seemed suddenly to double, and in the shape of guerrillas, potted us industriously from behind distant trees, rocks, or hasty earthworks. Under these various and unpleasant influences, combined with a fair infusion of malaria, our men rapidly lost health and spirits. Unfortunately, no proper medical supplies had been forwarded with our small force, 2 companies, and as the fall advanced, the want of quinine and stimulants became a serious annoyance. Moreover, our rations were running low. We had been 3 weeks without a new supply, and our commanding officer, Major Terrill, began to be uneasy as to the safety of his men. About this time, it was supposed that a train with rations would be due from the post 20 miles to the north of us. Yet it was quite possible that it would bring us food but no medicines, which were what we most needed. The command was too small to detach any part of it, and the major therefore resolved to send an officer alone to the post above us, where the rest of the 79th lay, and whence they could easily forward quinine and stimulants by the train if it had not left, or if it had, by a small cavalry escort. It so happened to my cost, as it turned out, that I was the only officer fit to make the journey, and I was accordingly ordered to proceed to blockhouse number 3 and make the required arrangements. I started alone just after dusk the next night, and during the darkness succeeded in getting within 3 miles of my destination. At this time I found that I had lost my way, and although aware of the danger of my act, was forced to turn aside and ask at a log cabin for directions. The house contained a dried-up old woman and 4 white-headed, half-naked children. The woman was either stone deaf or pretended to be so. But at all events, she gave me no satisfaction, and I remounted and rode away. On coming to the end of the lane into which I had turned to seek the cabin, I found to my surprise that the bars had been put up during my brief parley. They were too high to leap, and I therefore dismounted to pull them down. As I touched the top rail, I heard a rifle, and at the same instant felt a blow on both arms, which fell helpless. I staggered to my horse and tried to mount, but as I could use neither arm, the effort was vain, and I therefore stood, awaiting my fate. I am only conscious that I saw about me several graybacks, for I must have fallen fainting almost immediately. When I awoke, I was lying in the cabin nearby, upon a pile of rubbish. 10 or 12 guerrillas were gathered about the fire, apparently drawing lots for my watch, boots, hat, etc. I now made an effort to find out how far I was hurt. I discovered that I could use the left forearm and hand pretty well, and with this hand I felt the right limb all over until I touched the wound. The ball had passed from left to right through the left biceps and directly through the right arm just below the shoulder, emerging behind. The right hand and forearm were cold and perfectly insensible. I pinched them as well as I could to test the amount of sensation remaining, but the hand might as well have been that of a dead man. I began to understand that the nerves had been wounded and the part was utterly powerless. By this time, my friends had pretty well divided the spoils and, rising together, went out. The old woman then came to me and said, "Reckon you'd best get up. They'ns is going to take you away." To this I only answered, "Water, water." I had a grim sense of amusement on finding that the old woman was not deaf, for she went out and presently came back with a gourd full, which I eagerly drank. An hour later, the graybacks returned, and finding that I was too weak to walk, carried me out and laid me on the bottom of a common cart, with which they set out on a trot. The jolting was horrible, but within an hour I began to have in my dead right hand a strange burning, which was rather a relief to me. It increased as the sun rose and the day grew warm, until I felt as if the hand was caught and pinched in a red-hot vice. Then, in my agony, I begged my guard for water to wet it with, but for some reason they desired silence, and at every noise threatened me with a revolver. At length, the pain became absolutely unendurable, and I grew what it is the fashion to call demoralized. I screamed, cried, and yelled in my torture until, as I suppose, my captors became alarmed, and stopping, gave me a handkerchief, my own, I fancy, and a canteen of water with which I wetted the hand to my unspeakable relief. It is unnecessary to detail the events by which, finally, I found myself in one of the rebel hospitals near Atlanta. Here, for the first time, my wounds were properly cleansed and dressed by a Dr. Oliver Wilson, who treated me throughout with great kindness. I told him I had been a doctor, which had perhaps may have been in part of the unusual tenderness with which I was managed. The left arm was now quite easy, although, as will be seen, it never entirely healed. The right arm was worse than ever, the humerus broken, the nerves wounded, and the hand only alive to pain. I use this phrase because it is connected in my mind with a visit from a local visitor. I am not sure he was a preacher who used to go daily through the wards and talk to us and write our letters. One morning he stopped at my bed when this little talk occurred. "How are you, Lieutenant?" "Oh," said I, as usual, "all right, but this hand, which is dead except to pain." "Ah," said he, "such and thus will the wicked be. Such will you be if you die in your sins. You will go where only pain can be felt. For all eternity, all you will be as that hand, knowing pain only." I suppose I was very weak, but somehow I felt sudden and chilling horror of the possible universal pain, and suddenly fainted. When I awoke, the hand was worse, if that could be. It was red, shining, aching, burning, and as it seemed to me, perpetually rasped with hot files. When the doctor came, I begged for morphia. He said gravely, "We have none. You know you don't allow it to pass the lines." I turned to the wall and wetted the hand again, my sole relief. In about an hour, Dr. Wilson came back with 2 aides and explained to me that the bone was so broken as to make it hopeless to save it, and that besides amputation offered some chance of arresting the pain. I had thought of this before, but the anguish I felt, I cannot say endured, was so awful that I made no more of losing the limb than of parting with a tooth on account of a toothache. Accordingly, brief preparations were made, which I watched with a sort of eagerness, such as must forever be inexplicable to anyone who has not passed 6 weeks of torture like that which I had suffered. I had but one pang before the operation. As I arranged myself on the left side so as to make it convenient for the operator to use the knife, I asked, "Who is to give me the ether?" "We have none," said the person questioned. I set my teeth and said no more. I need not describe the operation. The pain felt was severe, but it was insignificant as compared to that of any other minute of the past 6 weeks. The limb was removed very near to the shoulder joint. As the second incision was made, I felt a strange lightning of pain play through the limb, defining every minutest fibril of nerve. This was followed by instant, unspeakable relief, and before the flaps were brought together, I was sound asleep. I have only a recollection that I said, pointing to the arm which lay on the floor, "There is the pain, and here am I. How queer." Then I slept the sleep of the just, or better, of the painless. From this time forward, I was free from neuralgia, but at a subsequent period, I saw a number of cases similar to mine in a hospital in Philadelphia. It is no part of my plan to detail my weary months of monotonous prison life in the South. In the early part of August 1863, I was exchanged, and after the usual 30 days furlough, returned to my regiment a captain. On the 19th of September, 1863, occurred the Battle of Chickamauga, in which my regiment took a conspicuous part. The close of our own share in this contest is, as it were, burnt into my memory with every last detail. It was about 6 p.m. when we found ourselves in line under a cover of a long, thin row of scrubby trees, beyond which lay a gentle slope, from which, again, rose a hill rather more abrupt and crowned with an earthwork. We received orders to cross this space and take the fort in front, while a brigade on our right was to make a like movement on its flank. Just before we emerged into the open ground, we noticed what I think was common in many fights, that the enemy had begun to bowl round shot at us, probably from failure of shell. We passed across the valley in good order, although the men fell rapidly all along the line. As we climbed the hill, our pace slackened and the fire grew heavier. At this moment, a battery opened on our left, the shots coming across our heads obliquely. It is this moment which is so printed on my recollection. I can see now, as if through a window, the gray smoke lit with red flashes, the long wavering line, the sky blue above, the trodden furrows blotted with blue blouses. Then it was as if the window closed and I knew and saw no more. No other scene in my life is thus scarred, if I may say so, into my memory. I have a fancy that the horrible shock which suddenly fell upon me must have had something to do with thus intensifying the momentary image then before my eyes. When I awakened, I was lying under a tree somewhere at the rear. The ground was covered with wounded, and the doctors were busy at an operating table, improvised from 2 barrels and a plank. At length, 2 of them, who were examining the wound about me, came up to where I lay. A hospital steward raised my head, and poured down some brandy and water, while another cut loose my pantaloons. The doctors exchanged looks and walked away. I asked the steward where I was hit. "Both thighs," said he. "The docs won't do nothing." "No use?" said I. "Not much," said he. "Not much means none at all," I answered. When he had gone, I set myself to thinking about a good many things which I had better have thought of before, but which in no way concern the history of my case. A half hour went by. I had no pain and did not get weaker. At last, I cannot explain why, but I began to look about me. At first, things appeared a little hazy, but I remember one which thrilled me a little even then. A tall, blonde, bearded major walked up to a doctor near me, saying, When you've a little leisure, just take a look at my side." "Do it now," said the doctor. The officer exposed his left hip. "Ball went in here and out here." The doctor looked up at him with a curious air, half pity, half amazement. "If you've got any message, you'd better best send it by me." "Why, you don't say it's serious?" was the reply. "Serious? Why, you're shot through the stomach. You won't live over the day." Then the man did what struck me as a very odd thing. "Anybody got a pipe?" Someone gave him a pipe. He filled it deliberately, struck a light with a flint, and sat down against a tree near to me. Presently the doctor came over to him and asked what he could do for him. "Send me a drink of bourbon." "Anything else?" "No." As the doctor left him, he called him back. "It's a little rough, Doc, isn't it?" No more passed, and I saw this man no longer, for another set of doctors were handling my legs, for the first time causing pain. A moment after, a steward put a towel over my mouth, and I smelt the familiar odor of chloroform, which I was glad enough to breathe. In a moment, the trees began to move around from left to right, then faster and faster. Then a universal grayness came before me, and I recalled nothing further until I awoke to consciousness in a hospital tent. I got hold of my own identity in a moment or two, and was suddenly aware of a sharp cramp in my left leg. I tried to get at it, to rub with my single arm, but finding myself too weak, hailed an attendant. "Just rub my left calf," said I, "if you please." "Calf," said he, "you ain't none, pardner. It's took off." "I know better," said I have pain in both legs." "Well, I never," said he, "you ain't got nary a leg." As I did not believe him, he threw off the covers, and to my horror showed me that I had suffered amputation of both thighs, very high up. "That will do," said I, faintly. A month later, to the amazement of everyone, I was so well as to be moved from the crowded hospital at Chattanooga to Nashville, where I filled one of the 10,000 beds of that vast metropolis of hospitals. Of the sufferings which then began, I shall presently speak. It will be best just now to detail the final misfortune from which here fell upon me. Hospital number 2, in which I lay, was inconveniently crowded with severely wounded officers. After my 3rd week, an epidemic of hospital gangrene broke out in my ward. In 3 days, it attacked 20 persons. Then an inspector came out, and we were transferred at once to the open air, placed in tents. Strangely enough, the wound in my remaining arm, which still suppurated, was seized with gangrene. The usual remedy, bromine, was used locally, but the main artery opened, which was tied, bled again, and at last, the final resort, the remaining arm was amputated at the shoulder joint. Against all chances, I recovered, to find myself a useless torso, more like some strange larval creature than anything of human shape. Of my anguish and horror of myself I dare not speak. I have dictated these pages not to shock my readers, but to possess them with facts in regard to the relation of the mind to the body. And I hasten, therefore, to such portions of my case as best illustrate these views. In January 1864, I was forwarded to Philadelphia in order to enter what was then known as the Stump Hospital, South Street. This favor was obtained through the influence of my father's friend, the late Governor Anderson, who has always manifested an interest in my case, for which I am deeply grateful. It was thought of at the time that Mr. Palmer, the leg maker, might be able to adapt some form of arm to my left shoulder, as on that side there remained 5 inches of the arm bone, which I could move to a moderate extent. The hope proved illusory, as the stump was always too tender to bear any pressure. The hospital referred to was in charge of several surgeons while I was an inmate, and was at all times a clean and pleasant home. It was filled with men who had lost one arm or leg, or one of each. As happened now and then, I saw one man who had lost both legs, and one who had parted with both arms, but none, like myself, stripped of every limb. There were collected in this place hundreds of these cases, which gave to it, with reason enough, the not very pleasing title of Stump Hospital. I spent here 3.5 months before my transfer to the United States Army Hospital for nervous diseases. Every morning I was carried out in an armchair and placed in the library, where someone was always ready to read or write for me, or to fill my pipe. The doctors lent me medical books, the ladies brought me luxuries, and fed me, and save that I was helpless to a degree which was humiliating, I was as comfortable as kindness could make me. I amused myself at this time by noting in my mind that all that I could learn from other limbless folk, and from myself as to the peculiar feelings from which I noticed in regard to lost members. I found that the great mass of men who had undergone amputations for many months felt the usual consciousness that they still had the lost limb. It itched or pained or was cramped, but never felt hot or cold. If they had painful sensations referred to, referred to it, the conviction of its existence continued unaltered for long periods. But where no pain was felt in it, then by degrees the sense of having that limb faded away entirely. I think we may, to some extent, explain this. The knowledge we possess of any part is made up of the numberless impressions from without which affect its sensitive surfaces, and which are transmitted through the nerves to the spinal nerve cells, and through them again to the brain. We are thus kept endlessly informed as to the existence of parts because the impressions which reach the brain are, by a law of our being, referred by us to the part from which they came. Now, when the part is cut off, the nerve trunks which led to it and from it, remaining capable of being impressed by irritations, are made to convey from the brain to the brain from the stump impressions which are as usual referred by the brain to the lost parts, to which these nerve threads belonged. In other words, the nerve is like a bell wire. You may pull it at any part of its course and thus ring the bell, as well as if you pulled at the end of the wire. But in any case, the intelligent servant will refer the pull to the front door and obey it accordingly. The impressions made on the cut ends of the nerve or on its sides are due often to the changes in the stump during healing, and consequently cease as it heals, so that finally, in a very healthy stump, no such impressions arise. The brain ceases to correspond with the lost leg, and as les absent on toujours tort, it is no longer remembered or recognized. But in some cases, such as mine, proved at last to my sorrow, the ends of the nerves undergo a curious alteration, and get to be enlarged and altered. This change, as I have seen in my practice of medicine, passes up the nerves towards the centers, and occasions a more or less irritation of the nerve fibers, producing neuralgia, which is usually referred to that part of the lost limb to which the affected nerve belongs. This pain keeps the brain ever mindful of the missing part, and imperfectly at least preserves to the man a consciousness of possessing that which he has not. Where the pains come and go, as they do in certain cases, the subjective sensations thus occasioned are very curious, since in such cases the man loses and gains and loses and regains the consciousness of the presence of lost parts, so that he will tell you, now I feel my thumb, now I feel my little finger. I should also add that nearly every person who has lost an arm above the elbow feels as though the lost member were bent at the elbow, and at times is vividly impressed with the notion that his fingers are strongly flexed. Another set of cases present a peculiarity which I am at a loss to account for. Where the leg, for instance, has been lost, they feel as if the foot was present, but as though the leg were shortened. If the thigh has been taken off, there seems to them to be a foot at the knee. If the arm, a hand, seems to be at the elbow or attached to the stump itself. As I have said, I was next sent to the United States Army Hospital for injuries and diseases of the nervous system. Before leaving Nashville, I had begun to suffer the most acute pain in my left hand, especially the little finger, and so perfect was the idea which was thus kept of the real presence of these missing parts that I found it hard at times to believe them absent. Often at night I would try with one lost hand to grope for the other. As, however, I had no pain in the right arm, the sense of the existence of that limb gradually disappeared, as did that of my legs also. Everything was done for my neuralgia which the doctors could think of, and at length my suggestion, I was removed to the above-named hospital. It was pleasant, suburban, old-fashioned country seat, its gardens surrounded by a circle of wooden one-story wards shaded by fine trees. There were some 300 cases of epilepsy, paralysis, St. Vitus's dance, and wounds of nerves. On one side of me lay a poor fellow, a Dane, who had the same burning neuralgia with which I once suffered, and which I now learned was only too common. This man had become hysterical from pain. He carried a sponge in his pocket and a little bottle of water in one hand, with which he constantly wetted the burning hand. Every sound increased his torture, and he even poured water into his boots to keep himself from feeling too sensibly the rough fiction of the souls when walking. Like him, I was greatly eased by having small doses of morphia injected under the skin of my shoulder with a hollow needle fitted to a syringe. As I improved under the morphia treatment, I began to be disturbed by the horrible variety of suffering about me. One man walked sideways. There was another who could not smell. Another was dumb from an explosion. In fact, everyone had his own grotesquely painful peculiarity. Near me was a strange case of palsy of the muscle, called rhomboids, whose office it was to hold down the shoulder blades flat on the back during the motions of the arms, which in themselves were strong enough. When, however, he lifted these members, the shoulder blades stood out from the back like wings, and got him the sobriquet of the angel. In my ward were also the cases of fits, which very much annoyed me, as upon any great change in the weather, it was common to have a dozen convulsions in view at once. Dr. Neek, one of our physicians, told me that on one occasion 150 fits took place within 36 hours. On my complaining of these sights, whence I alone could not fly, I was placed in the paralytic and wound ward, which I found much more pleasant. A month of skillful treatment eased me entirely of my aches, and then I began to experience certain curious feelings, upon which, having nothing to do, and nothing to do anything with, I reflected a good deal. It was a good while before I could correctly explain to my own satisfaction the phenomenon which at this time I was called upon to observe. By the various operations already described, I had lost about 4/5 of my weight. As a consequence of this, I ate much less than usual and could scarcely have consumed the ration of a soldier. I slept also but little, for as sleep is the repose of the brain, made necessary by the waste of its tissue during thought and voluntary movement, and as this latter did not exist in my case, I needed only that rest which was necessary to repair such exhaustion of the nerve centers as was induced by thinking and automatic movements of the viscera. I observed at this time also that my heart, in place of beating as it once did 78 in the minute, pulsated only 45 times in this interval, a fact to be easily explained by the perfect quiescence to which I was reduced, and the consequent absence of the healthy and constant stimulus to the muscles of the heart which exercise occasions. Notwithstanding these drawbacks, my physical health was good, which I confess surprised me, for this among other reasons. It is said that a burn of 2/3 of the surface destroys life, because then all the excretory matters which this portion of the glands of the skin evolved are thrown upon the blood and poison the man, just as happens in an animal whose skin the physiologist has varnished, so as in this way to destroy its function. Yet here I was, having lost at least 1/3 of my skin, and apparently none the worse for it. Still more remarkable, however, were the physical changes which I now began to perceive. I found to my horror that at times I was less conscious of myself, of my own existence, than used to be the case. The sensation was so novel that at first it quite bewildered me. I felt like asking someone constantly if I were really George Dedlow or not. Aware how absurd I should seem after such a question, I refrained from speaking of my case and strove more keenly to analyze my feelings. At times, the conviction of my want of being myself was overwhelming and most painful. It was, as well as I can describe it, a deficiency overwhelming and deficiency in the egoistic sentiment and individuality. About 1/2 of the sensitive surface of my skin was gone, and thus much of the relation to the outer world destroyed. As a consequence, a large part of the receptive central organs must be out of employ, and then, like other idle things, degenerating rapidly. Moreover, all the great central ganglia, which give rise to the movements of the limbs, were also eternally at rest. Thus 1/2 of me was absent or functionally dead. This set me to thinking how much a man might lose and yet live. If I were unhappy enough to survive, I might part with my spleen, at least, as many a dog has done, and grown fat afterwards. The other organs with which we breathe and circulate the blood would be essential. So also would be the liver, but at least half of the intestines might be dispensed with, and of course, all of the limbs. And as to the nervous system, the only parts really necessary to life are a few small ganglia. Were the rest absent or inactive, we should have a man reduced, as it were, to the lowest terms and leading an almost vegetative existence. Would such a being, I asked myself, possess the sense of individuality in its usual completeness, even if his organs of sensation remained and he were capable of consciousness? Of course. Without them, he could not have it any more than a dahlia or a tulip. But with it, how then? I concluded that it would be at minimum, and that if utter loss of relation to the outer world were capable of destroying a man's consciousness of himself, the destruction of half his sensitive surfaces might well occasion, in a less degree, a like result, and so diminish the sense of individual existence. I thus reached the conclusion that a man is not his brain or any part of it, but all of his economy, and that to lose any part must lessen the sense of his own existence. I found but one person who properly appreciated this great truth. She was a New England lady from Hartford, an agent, I think, for some commission, perhaps the sanitary. After I had told her my views and feelings, she said, "Yes, I comprehend. The fractional entities of vitality are embraced in the oneness of the unitary ego. Life," she added, "is the garnered condensation of objective impressions, and as the objective is the remote father of the subjective, so must individuality, which is but focused subjectivity, suffer and fade when the sensation lenses, by which the rays of impression are condensed, become destroyed." I am not quite clear that I fully understood her, but I think she appreciated my ideas, and I felt grateful for her kindly interest. The strange want I have spoken of now haunted and perplexed me so constantly that I became moody and wretched. While in this state, a man from a neighboring ward fell one morning into conversation with the chaplain within earshot of my chair. Some of the words arrested my attention, and I turned my head to see and listen. The speaker, who wore a sergeant's chevron and carried one arm in a sling, was a tall, loosely made person with a pale face, light eyes of a washed-out blue tint, and very sparse yellow whiskers. His mouth was weak, both lips being almost alike, and so that the organ might have been turned upside down without affecting its expression. His forehead, however, was high and thinly covered with sandy hair. I should have said, as a phrenologist, will feeble, emotional, but not passionate, likely to be an enthusiast, or weakly bigot. I caught enough of what passed to make me call to the sergeant when the chaplain left him. "Good morning," said he. "How do you get on?" "Not at all," I replied. "Where were you hit?" "Oh, at Chancellorsville. I was shot in the shoulder. I have what the doctors call paralysis of the median nerve, but I guess Dr. Meek and the lightning battery will fix it in time. When my time's out, I'll go back to Kearsarge and try on the school teaching again. I was a fool to leave it." "Well," said I, "you're better off than I." "Yes," he answered, "in more ways than one. I belong to the new church. It's a great comfort for a plain man like me, when he's weary and sick, to be able to turn away from earthly things and hold converse daily with the great and good who have left the world. We have a circle in Coates Street. If it wasn't for the comfort I get there, I should have wished myself dead many a time. I ain't got kith or kin on earth, but this matters little when one can talk to them daily and know that they are in the spheres above us." "It must be a great comfort," I replied, "if only one could believe it." "Believe," he repeated. "How can you help it? Do you suppose anything dies?" "No," I said, "the soul does not, I am sure, and as to matter, it merely changes form." But why then, said he, should not the dead soul talk to the living? In space, no doubt, exist all forms of matter, merely in finer, more ethereal being. You can't suppose a naked soul moving about without a bodily garment. No creed teaches that. And if its new clothing be of like substance to ours, only of ethereal fineness, a more delicate recrystallization about the eternal spiritual nucleus, must not it then possess powers as much more delicate and refined as is the new material in which it was reclad? Not very clear, I answered, but after all, the thing should be susceptible of some form of proof to our present senses. And so it is, said he. Come tomorrow with me, and you shall see and hear for yourself. I will, said I, if the doctor will lend me the ambulance. It was so arranged, as the surgeon in charge was kind enough as usual to oblige me with the loan of his wagon and 2 orderlies to lift my useless trunk. On the day following, I found myself with my new comrade in a house in Coates Street, where a circle was in the daily habit of meeting. So soon as I had been comfortably deposited in an armchair beside a large pine table, the rest of those assembled seated themselves and for some time preserved an unbroken silence. During this pause, I scrutinized the persons present. Next to me, on my right, sat a flabby man with ill-marked, baggy features and injected eyes. He was, as I learned afterwards, an eclectic doctor who had tried his hand at medicine and several of its quackish variations, finally settling down on eclecticism, which I believe professes to be a scientific medicine what vegetarianism is to common sense everyday dietetics. Next to him sat a female authoress, I think, of 2 somewhat feeble novels and much pleasanter to look at than her books. She was, I thought, a good deal excited at the prospect of spiritual revelations. Her neighbor was a pallid, careworn girl with very red lips and large brown eyes of great beauty. She was, as I learned afterwards, a magnetic patient of the doctor and had deserted her husband, a master mechanic, to follow this new light. The others were, like myself, strangers brought hither by mere curiosity. One of them was a lady in deep black, closely veiled. Beyond her and opposite to me sat the sergeant, and next to him the medium, a man named Blake. He was well dressed and wore a good deal of jewelry and had large black side whiskers. A shrewd visaged, large-nosed, full-lipped man, formed by nature to appreciate the pleasant things of sensual existence. Before I had ended my survey, he turned to the lady in black and asked if she wished to see anyone in the spirit world. She said, yes, rather feebly. Is the spirit present, he asked, upon which 2 knocks were heard in affirmation. Ah, said the medium, the name is that of a child. It is a male child. Is it Albert? No, Alfred. Great heavens, said the lady, my child, my boy. On this, the medium arose and became strangely convulsed. I see, he said, I see a fair-haired boy. I see blue eyes. I see above you, beyond you. At the same time, pointing fixedly over her head, she turned with a wild start. Where? Whereabouts? A blue-eyed boy, he continued. Over your head, he cries. He says, Mama, Mama. The effect of this on the woman was unpleasant. She stared about her for a moment and exclaiming, I'm coming, Alfie, fell in hysterics on the floor. 2 or 3 persons raised her and aided her into an adjoining room, but she remained at the table, as though well accustomed to like scenes. After this, several of the strangers were called upon to write the names of the dead with whom they wished to communicate. The names were spelled out by the agency of affirmative knocks, when the correct letters were touched by the applicant, who was furnished with an alphabet card upon which he tapped the letters in turn, the medium, meanwhile scanning his face very keenly. With some, the names were readily made out. With one, a stolid personage of disbelieving type, every attempt failed, until at last the spirit signified by knocks that he was a disturbing agency, and that while he remained, all our efforts would fail. Upon this, some of the company proposed that he should leave, of which invitation he took advantage with a skeptical sneer at the whole performance. As he left us, the sergeant leaned over and whispered to the medium, who next addressed himself to me. Sister Euphemia, he said, indicating the lady with the large eyes, will act as your medium. I am unable to do more. These things exhaust my nervous system. Sister Euphemia, said the doctor, will aid us. Think, if you please, sir, of a spirit, and she will endeavor to summon it to our circle. Upon this, a wild idea came into my head. I answered, I am thinking, as you directed me to. The medium sat with her arms folded, looking steadily at the center of the table. For a few moments there was silence. Then a series of irregular knocks began. Are you present? Said the medium. The affirmative raps were twice given. I should think, said the doctor, that there were two spirits present. His words sent a thrill through my heart. Are there two? He questioned. A double rap. Yes, two, said the medium. Will it please the spirits to make us conscious of their names in this world? A single knock. No. Will it please them to say how they are called in the world of spirits? Again came the irregular raps. 3, 4, 8, 6. Then a pause. And 3, 4, 8, 7. I think, said the authoress, they must be numbers. Will the spirits, she said, be good enough to aid us? Shall we use the alphabet? Yes, was rapped very quickly. Are these numbers? Yes, again. I will write them, she added, and doing so took up the card and tapped the letters. The spelling was pretty rapid and ran thus as she tapped in turn, first the letters and last the numbers she had already set down. United States Army Medical Museum, numbers 3486, 3487. The medium looked up with puzzled expression. Good gracious, said I. They are my legs, my legs. What followed, I ask no one to believe except those who, like myself, have communed with the beings of another sphere. Suddenly, I felt a strange return of my self-consciousness. I was re-individualized, so to speak. A strange wonder filled me, and to the amazement of everyone, I arose and staggered a little, walked across the room on limbs invisible to them or me. It was no wonder I staggered, for as I briefly reflected, my legs had been 9 months in the strongest alcohol. At this instant, all my new friends crowded around me in astonishment. Presently, however, I felt myself sinking slowly. My legs were going, and in a moment I was resting feebly on 2 stumps upon the floor. It was too much. All that was left of me fainted and rolled over senseless. I have little to add. I am now at home in the West, surrounded by every form of kindness and every possible comfort. But alas, I have so little surety of being myself that I doubt my own honesty in drawing my pension and feel absolved from gratitude to those who are kind to a being who is uncertain of being enough himself to be conscientiously responsible. It is needless to add that I am not a happy fraction of a man, that I am eager for the day when I shall rejoin the lost members of my corporeal family in another and a happier world. The Case of George Dedlow, from the July 1866 edition of the Atlantic Monthly magazine. Quite a story, right? It has everything. We have amputations. We have an armless, legless man. We have seances and ghostly legs tapping out their accession numbers from the Army Medical Museum in Washington. This is one of my favorite stories of all time, and I hope you enjoyed this today. This is a fictionalized account. Many of the myths associated with Civil War medicine appear there, including the lack of anesthesia. We'll note that as of the records of the Civil War tell us that 95% of surgeries done during the Civil War were done under some form of anesthesia. We have morphine present in this story. We have lots of the elements that we talk about at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in this story, The Case of George Dedlow by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell. That's going to draw an end to this evening's reading of this short story. Again, one of my favorites of all time. I hope you enjoyed the program this evening. If you did, consider supporting these programs. Become a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. You can do that by going to the link in the comments section. You can become a member and support these videos and programs like this. That allows us to continue doing these programs digitally, to continue our work at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick, Maryland, and our two satellite locations, the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office here in Washington, D.C., and the Pry House Field Hospital Museum on Antietam Battlefield. You'll also get lots of cool perks, and you get to come and see the museum and all of three of our museums for free. Hope you've enjoyed this evening's program. We'll see you next time. I hope you have a great day and happy Halloween.